All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's very good to see you and to have you here for our Bible study time. We are moving into John 17, and we're not going to get far into the text, mainly just because we're going to be looking at some introductory material into John 17. Now, the reason why I say introductory material, even though we're not moving into a new section. We've been saying this whole entire time and establishing it by what we're studying, 13, 14, 15, 16, and into 17 is all one big section. But inside of the section, in that one big unit, you have different topics that are being brought up to undergird or to help build up the ultimate point of discussion, which is... What's the point of this section? Unity. How are we going to keep unity amongst the brethren, and especially as Jesus is preparing to leave? And you have all those different elements that are coming into play. There's a discussion of love in chapter 13. Chapter 14, there's discussion of the hope that we have of heaven and the following of His Word and of His doctrine. Then you have 15, 16 coming into play, and how that the Holy Spirit was going to be given so as to help them stay unified in that Word through His guidance and leading them into all truth. Now, as we get into chapter 17, we're going to have another element that's being brought into the discussion to help bring about that unity that the church is supposed to have. And it's going to be found in Christ's prayer, but with His prayer, we're going to have a lot of connection being made to the fact on how that He is stepping into the high priest position, and how that's going to end up being a major theme and a major point for the prayer that's going to be had. So we closed last time with verses 31, 33 of chapter 16. Jesus answered them, "Do you now believe? Behold, the hour cometh, yea, is now come, that ye shall be scattered every man to his own, and shall leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. These things have I spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace." So there's our theme, our overall connection. Unity, peace. "In the world ye shall have tribulation. But be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." So we're discussing how that through this, that in following Christ, keeping His teachings, trying to strive to keep the unity inside of the body, there's going to be persecution that comes from the outside. And that even in the midst of that persecution, we're able to have peace, joy that He gives us and that He leaves us with. And how that this peace is being discussed in connection with tribulation. Most people would think, well, if you're a Christian, you should have peace without tribulation. But no, Jesus is saying this is happening at the same time with persecution. So it's not a peace without this. It is actually a peace with this. And then jumping into chapter 17. Chapter 17, with Jesus' prayer, is going to end up being a summary of what has been taught since chapter 13. He's going to put it all together for us, and ultimately, in piecing all of this together, how all of this is going to be accomplished. And we're going to find, which we're not going to pinpoint them directly, but as we're going through this, you can be looking for the similarities between this prayer and the way that Jesus taught His disciples to pray back in Matthew 7.
6.
Did I do it again? I don't know why I'm so stuck on 7. Matthew 6. But even with the similarities, there's also going to be some differences. Now, as we said, what we have being presented here is Christ's prayer, but it's going to be a priestly type of prayer. And that after His death, He is going to be established as a permanent priest for all time. And we are needing to take the time in this, this form of introduction to be brought into view of the discussion of priesthood, because we have never been under that kind of system. The Old Testament systems, specifically the time frame of Moses and the establishment of the tribe of Levi and the priesthood and the high priest, going into the holy place and then the most holy place and the establishment of sacrifices and everything like that, we have never been associated with that. So to some degree, if I can phrase it this way, we are at a great disadvantage from what the Jews would have been understanding, and even to some degree the Gentiles, though they were in idolatrous practices, they were worshiping idols. Even under that system, they had priests. And they understood the significance of that office. And that what's being established and what's being established in our mind is how that the priesthood is at the heart of religion. Now, this is important for us to get a handle on, because as Christians, according to what Peter wrote, what are we? We are a royal priesthood. Well, okay, if we are going to step into that kind of role, then we need to make sure that we're understanding just how important and significant this actually is. Now, what is also key to this, and we'll look at this as we go through Hebrews very quickly, or some of these passages from Hebrews, is how that this priesthood is not going to be like the Levitical priesthood. But while it's not like that priesthood, it is in fact similar, and it's important for him to step into this role because the priesthood involved being able to approach God. You need a priest with a sacrifice to go before you on your behalf so as to petition God. That's how it worked under the Old Testament system. Well, Christ is going to step into both roles. He's going to step in as high priest to go before God in the mercy seat, but he's also stepping into the role as being the one sacrifice that's able to free us from sin and thus make it to where we are then able to go before God ourselves, because we are in that priesthood. So a quick look at some passages from Hebrews to better get this ingrained in our minds as to where we're going to be going in John 17. The very first chapter, Hebrews 1, verse 1. God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high. The Hebrew letter opens with Jesus being involved in this priestly work. What's being described here is what the priests would do with their sacrifices. They would sprinkle the blood. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go into the most holy place and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat. And that would be an atonement for all the sins of everybody in Israel, including himself, including the high priest. So this is how it opens, and this is how it's going to continue all the way through. You jump over to chapter 4 and verse 14. This again, speaking of Jesus, and it says, "Seeing then that we have a great high priest." The office of high priest was already a special place. So just saying high priest by itself carried a great amount of significance and reverence. But now what do you think it does when you throw the word great in front of it?
Magnifies it.
It magnifies it, it elevates it even more when we're discussing it in the connection with Jesus and the role that he plays. Seeing that we have a great high priest that has passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. For we have not an high priest, so again, there's the role that he's in, which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. And there is the superiority that Jesus has in this office. That while he was like us, and that he was tempted in all points like as we are, and yet he was without sin. The Old Testament high priest could not make that claim. As we said, on Day of Atonement, he went in, offered atonement for all of Israel, but also for himself and for his sins. Now, because we have this kind of high priest, and that as we have gone through our John study, we have continuously being presented to us how Jesus shared full fellowship with God. And that because of what's talked about in verse 15. He was tempted, yet without sin. Sin separates. And that's why you have the whole setup of the Old Testament system. You can only get so close to God because of sin. Well, Christ did not have to deal with that. Christ had full connection of fellowship and communion with God. And that will be seen in John 17 with the prayer that's being made. So there's no sin that's on his charge that would have separated them from each other. And because of that, and the full atonement of the sacrifice that's about to be made. So in John 17, in the prayer, Jesus is going to make mention of the fact on how that he has come to finish the work of God. Well, okay, to what degree has that been finished? Verse 16. Because of his office of being high priest, being tempted like as we are, yet without sin, and being that perfect sacrifice, now look at what we have. Let us, therefore, come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. That's why this is so important. To have Christ as high priest and for him to offer the sacrifice that he offered. Look at what it has brought. For everybody else before this, they were kept at a distance from God. But we can come boldly, that's confidently, unto the throne of grace. We do not have to have anybody stand as a go-between for us outside of Jesus as our mediator. And so that's one of the major problems with Roman Catholicism, in that you've got to step into a booth with a quote-unquote priest there in this special office. Everybody else is just laymen, you're normal people, while this man sits in this special place as being priest, and you have to go to him so that he can go to God on your behalf. That's completely backwards from what we have being talked about here. Everybody that is a Christian is able to step into this position as being priest. We are involved in offering spiritual gifts, and that we can boldly go before God. And especially, as it's laid out in verse 16, notice that we may obtain mercy. That's an important element, and even in consideration of where Jesus is at this time in John 17, and he's praying to the Father. What's one of the things he's going to be praying for?
Well, when he's on the cross, he prays for mercy in that, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Okay. So yeah, there's the mercy for others.
So would it be this cup can pass?
All right. Is he not looking for mercy for himself? Father, if it be at all possible, let this cup pass from me. You see, there is a high priest that has been touched with the feelings of our infirmities, and yet without sin, because he did what the Father wanted. So as we have it being pictured in John 17 of him approaching God in that fashion is an illustration of what we have being talked about here in verse 16. We can go boldly before the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. How do I know that I can do that? It's what we're going to study in John 17. That's what Jesus did. And his time of trial and his time of suffering, he went before the throne looking for mercy and grace. Now, once again, this section also creates a problem for those, for example, Andrew Sluter and others, and I think even so what you've been bringing up with the 80-70 crowd is a bit new to me. I've been trying to dig into it, and it's like I'm not doubting what you're presenting, but it's just, it is very strange to me on what is now being presented about what they're saying about Jesus on the cross.
You
And-
mean the concept of him being separated from the
Yes.
Father?
Yeah, through that fashion. But you piece all that together with what's going on here, that creates a problem for that crowd, because the Hebrew writer says that he didn't have sin. So if he did not have sin, then how could he have been separated from God? Why would God need to turn his back, quote unquote, on Jesus because, well, he became sin for us, or he took sin upon us, and thus he became a sinner? Can't have it. Did you have a thought?
No.
Oh,
it was
Mark.
just-
Did you have something, Mark?
Not really, but.
Okay. I thought I saw your hand go up.
Oh, no.
Okay.
But I would comment on that very thing, because he turned his back on him because he has taken our sin to the cross, not his own, because he didn't have any.
Mm-hmm.
God hates sin, so he turns his back on him. You see it all over in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he turned his back on Christ, on his own cross, dying for our sin.
Well, while it is true that he hates sin, it's not a situation, I would argue from the scriptures, that it's not a situation that when it comes to sacrifices being offered, that then God is going to turn away from that. Because under the Old Testament system, you had, those offerings being a representation of the people's sin, and that this animal is dying on their behalf. And even with the Day of Atonement, I believe it is, they had two offerings that they would give, where one would be slain, and then they would have a goat that the high priest would set his hands upon that goat, and that being a representation of that sacrifice, taking all the sins of Israel, and they would actually set that goat loose to where it would go out of the city. So even in those situations, you have the Old Testament talking about when Israel offers sacrifices, that God looks upon those sacrifices. And I would say that that's one of the areas that gets left out in the discussion, is that while I would agree that the Bible talks about him becoming sin for us or taking sin upon him, that would not put him in a position to where God would then not be able to look upon him.
Got a question kind of statement on that very thing. In the Old Testament, when they sacrificed, it didn't take sin away, it postponed it.
Right.
It moved it down. In the New Testament, when you are baptized, you come out of water, you are as a new man.
Yeah.
All your sin is gone. Not held against you no more at all. All people that were prior to that, sins went away as well. When he died was a day of very dark for God. Why he turned his back on him? Not turn it on him as per se, turned his back towards him. To not to look at the sin.
Yeah, but again, all throughout the Old Testament system, you have God watching over the sacrifices. So if this is the ultimate sacrifice, why would God not be looking on that sacrifice?
Well, it says it. What is that? Mark 16:16.
Mhm.
Love the world, or love man, or have his own, that he gave his only begotten son.
What? John 3:16. Yeah. Right.
So I mean, that's the start of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is starting over.
Mm-hmm.
We're not living under the old law like some of the other religions
Mm-hmm.
that are trying to still hold that law.
Mm-hmm.
That we're in a new law where you can be forgiven with a prayer. It's, of course, you have to be baptized.
Right.
But I mean, it's that easy. You're not having to go out and sacrifice on that.
Right, I agree. Yeah. Yeah.
So, it gets rid of sin. It doesn't postpone it.
Right.
Move it to a later day.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts? Okay. So let's see here. So that's Hebrews 4. Let's go to Hebrews 5. Hebrews 5:1. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men, notice, in things pertaining to God. So here's that essential point of priesthood. As we were saying, under the Old Testament system, why this would be such a vital office. Here's what they're doing. They are ordained for men, for the purpose of men and service of men, in the things pertaining to God, that he, the priest, may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. That's a special place. That is a very special role to have under that system. But it's not only for the sake of everybody else, but it's also for the sake of themselves. Because as you are involved in offering gifts and sacrifices for sins of others, what should you be reminded of?
You have your own issues.
You have your own sins. Who am I to be offering these gifts and sacrifices for everybody else when I'm a man and I'm flesh just like everybody else? So while it is a special place, and that to a large degree they had a lot of authority over the children of Israel, that's what leadership is supposed to do, and that is supposed to humble you in recognition of, wow, look at what I'm able to do for others. But then what it also represents for me too. Who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for that he himself is also compassed with infirmity. So that's the very thing we were just talking about. And here the Hebrew writer talks about it. And by reason hereof he ought, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer for sins. But then verse 4, and no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. Christ was appointed to this office. And he's made that statement throughout the study of John. He's not doing anything based upon or by the standard of his own will. But as the Father has said unto him, has spoken unto him, he's speaking unto others. And as to what the Father has appointed him to do and to be, that's what he's done. So to where anybody that might try to make the claim of Jesus, oh, well, he's just doing this by his own accord. No. Not so. And they would try to use that as an accusation against him. Well, God's not appointed this man. But in fact, he has. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. Even as we move into the Hebrew letter, the Hebrew letters continuing to establish that deity position. He is God. He is the Son of God. And the things that he did, Christ glorified not himself. He did not appoint himself here. He did not place himself here or have any other man bring him to this position. But he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. As he saith also in another place, Thou art a priest forever, and that after the order of Melchizedek. We have the establishment of his office and the duration for the office. It's forever. This one's not going to change. Who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. Once again with verse 7, we're back in chapter 17 of John. In the days of his flesh, that's where we are now. When he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears. That's what the gospel accounts record for us, and that he was in great sorrow. And even in John, he's mentioned how that his, how did he word it? His soul was in great trouble. And that he made supplications, prayer and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death. So Jesus knew where to go. And he knew that the Father could have saved him if it was in accordance with his will. And he was heard in that he feared. And that's an interesting concept to take in. That here we have the Son of God coming from God, knowing the things of God, and yet we're told that in this time he was afraid. Now again, that goes back to the infirmity aspect. Does Jesus know what it is to be afraid? To fear like we do? Yeah.
Was it death that he was afraid of, or does it not say?
Yeah, doesn't really say.
But he's already pointed out with when he says, Lazarus, come forth, that it's just basically changing places.
Right.
So he understands that, but there's so much more that he knows he has to endure.
Hebrews 4:15, it says he was not appointed like we are, yet without sin, he knows what we go through.
And that it could be, so just as a possibility, so like for me, and I might have mentioned to some of you, I'm not necessarily afraid of death, but I am afraid of how I'm going to die.
Well, you'll pass that anyway.
Right. Yeah, so I won't feel it. And that it's so it's not really the element of death itself, but just what he's going to have to endure. To be beaten, spat upon, embarrassed, and then have to endure the cross itself. And that it's, well, okay, here are all these things in theory of how we're supposed to endure things and go through things. But theorizing about something and actually going through it are two separate things. And now here's Jesus, and he's fixing to have to go through that stuff. And he's afraid. And there's that humanity aspect of the Son of God. He is God, but he's also man. And in this darkest hour, he's able to go to the Father. And that's what he's trying, and that's what the illustration is for keeping unity for all of us as he's preparing for his suffering, while he is desiring to have his apostles there with him, or at least some of his apostles. He calls a few of them to watch and pray with him, and yet they end up falling asleep. We would like to be able to lean on others, to lean on our brethren, but sometimes our brethren fall short. Well, when that happens, are we alone? Was he alone? No, just as he said back in chapter 16, you're going to scatter, you're going to leave me alone, but I'm not alone. The Father's going to be with me. And that's an important aspect for us to remember as we're going through this. Him being high priest, we being priests, we can go before God for mercy and grace in our darkest hours. We're not alone. And with that realization, then it should help bind everybody together. And to be able to keep the faith and be steadfast and keep moving forward. Or at least, not even necessarily moving forward, but as Paul wrote to the Ephesians, and doing everything, doing all that you can to stand. Sometimes you just have to hold your ground. And as we studied in John and Matthew, when the apostles were out in the boat in the midst of the storm, and the waves and the wind were against them, and Jesus saw them rowing. Sometimes you're just rowing just to, even though you're not getting anywhere. But you just keep rowing. But through all of that, God sees. And he watches. And then we are learning from that at some point, help will come. Now, we're not going to see Jesus walking on the water, but it's the idea that, every storm has got to find its end. Every storm eventually breaks. So you just hold on. Just be patient. And you know what? If you're afraid, prayers and supplications. And even with strong crying and tears if you have to. There's nothing wrong with it. Then it keeps going in verse 8, though he were a son. So we're discussing all these things, but it's laid out pretty easily in the Hebrew letter. Though he were a son, deity, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. So there's that experience aspect. And being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. John 17 will have the discussion within it of eternal life. And that eternal life in relation to this office of priesthood. And that was sacrifice. Then you travel over to Hebrews 7. And we're going to be in Hebrews 7 for a good bit. For this Melchizedek, so we're back in chapter 4, I believe it was, on how it was mentioned. He will be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Where'd it go? Or was it 5? 5. 5 and 6. So that's brought up again in chapter 7. And here's the reason why. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. So there's that office being discussed. Of priesthood, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all. Here's your father Abraham giving a 10th over to Melchizedek. So there's a shadow of what's coming under the Levitical, or under the law of Moses, with that priesthood, and how the 10th and the tithe is going to carry forward. But here's the reason why. To whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation, king of righteousness. This is speaking of Melchizedek. And after that, also king of Salem, which is king of peace. Why would this be a significant point for Christ to be made a priest after the order of Melchizedek? Okay, so that's coming later in chapter 7. But just look at it. King of righteousness, king of peace. Christ came to combine both of those things too. He came to fulfill all righteousness. He came so as to make man righteous with his sacrifice. And in making man righteous through the shedding of his blood, that brings peace. Now again, as we are, we're looking at this from our standpoint, but then also just considering our religious friends out in the world that have a wrong view about these things, and that they would say, well, Jesus is coming later so as to be made king, establish his kingdom here on earth, and then bringing peace. That's not how the Hebrew writer writes it. The Hebrew writer writes it all in the connection of present tense. He's already done this. He is the King of righteousness. He is the King of peace. And it's just as he said in John 16. This peace is found in him. Not out in the world. Out in the world you're going to have tribulation. But what if we are in him? What if we are in his body, in his kingdom? Then we're supposed to have peace. Peace and joy that he offers. Dropping down to verse 11. Here we have the contrast being set up or being shown of that old priesthood to this new priesthood. If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? So he's establishing for the Jewish audience, look, you do not need to be troubled by the fact that God is establishing another priesthood. Because if you're paying attention to your history, you would know there was already a priesthood before Aaron. But they got so hung up on their system, and they're completely missing these points. For the priesthood being changed, there's made of necessity a change also of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man, notice this, gave attendance at the altar. That's what the priesthood did. Giving attendance at the altar, and that daily for the service of the people, so as to help keep them in right relationship with God. And now here we have Jesus stepping into that role after the order of Melchizedek, and he now gives attendance to the altar. Verse 14, for it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident, for that after the similitude of Melchizedek there ariseth another priest, who was made not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of and here's a key element, but after the power of an endless life. For he testifieth that thou art a high priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Jesus died to live again. And in living again, he lives forever. And in living forever, he lives as a priest. And that's further going to be established in the Hebrew, in chapter 7. Yes, ma'am.
Just a little small comment, going back to the previous point also, is that they loved Moses, but they always claim their lineage. Oh, I came from Abraham on through this way or whatever, and yet they forget that the patriarchal law that was there, and it's all about the law of Moses.
Right. Yeah, how it was that even during the time frame of Adam, and you have Cain and Abel, and they're bringing their own gifts. Well, how's that possible? Job, for that matter. Even though Job is placed in our Bibles, what we would consider as being during the time frame of Moses, it's pretty evident that it belongs in the patriarchal system because he's involved in offering sacrifices for his children. And even for that matter, Abraham, going from place to place, every place that he went, what did Abraham do?
He set up an altar.
Huh?
He set up an altar.
He built an altar and he sacrificed. And all of that's before the priesthood of Aaron. So that in fact, while they would think about the law of Moses as being this glorious and onerous thing, which it was, but with Christianity, you're actually going back to the patriarchal setup, to where the heads of the family or the heads of the household are able to approach God and offering those sacrifices, which is far better. So yeah, that's a good connection there, good point. So verse 17, then verse 19. For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did. By the which, now here's why it's better. By the which we draw nigh unto God. Just as we said, under the Old Testament system, there was God, there was Levitical priesthood, the blood of bulls and goats, and then there was everybody else. And that those sacrifices could not make a man perfect, whole, or complete, but that there was a continual remembrance of sin every year. So what was needed? As we're discussing, what was all of that pointing towards? We're actually needing something better than this. This isn't cutting it. Well, here it is. With Christ and His priesthood, with Christ and His sacrifice, becoming both of those together for mankind, we draw nigh unto God. We are able to get closer to God than they could. And that's what's talked about in John 14. No man cometh unto the Father but by me or through me. There's that fellowship, that we're able to be brought in communion with Him. So what's being established for us is that there's not anything that's going to be set up after this. This is it. This is what's needed. And in John 17, Jesus will say in His prayer that He is going to finish that work. And as Jesus is on the cross, He says before the audience, it's finished. And then gives up the ghost. Verse 20 of chapter 7. And inasmuch as not without an oath He was made priest, for those priests were made without an oath, but this with an oath by Him that said unto Him, the Lord sware, and will not repent, Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. By so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament. And they truly were many priests because they were not suffered to continue by reason of death. But this man, because he continueth forever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. There's not going to be anything after this, because he lives forever. That other priesthood, a priest would serve until he died. Well, okay, that's it. But now we serve a high priest that has overcome death. Verse 25, wherefore he is able to save them to the uttermost. Notice this, that come unto God by him. All throughout the Hebrew letter, and even as we've been going through our John study, we've had these repetitive statements about coming to God, coming to the Father. Now the Jews would have thought, oh no, we're with God. Well, then why can't you go into the holy place? Why can't you go into the most holy place? Why is it that you can only stand outside of the temple? They're missing the point. But with Christ and His office and His sacrifice, He's opened that way. He's made that way available. And that through salvation, and that to the uttermost, seeing He ever liveth to make intercession for them. For such an high priest became us, who is holy. Now notice these character elements about our high priest. Who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens. A sinless life was essential. Who needeth not daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice, first for his own sins, and then for the people's. For this he did once, when he offered up himself. In John 17, does Jesus pray for his own sins? Does he make any kind of confession? No. No mention of transgressions or of trespasses that he's made of God or made before God? And that's because he had none. And even in John 17, Jesus will make mention of sanctification. And that's going to come in verse 28 with the word consecrated. For the law maketh men high priests which have infirmity. But the word of the oath, which was since the law, maketh the Son, who is consecrated for evermore. Now, we needed to run through at least these verses, and there's plenty more that we could dig into in the Hebrew letter. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the reason why we needed to run through this is because we have never been under the Levitical system. And so to a large degree do not have a good concept of the priesthood and what it was like. I mean, for many of us, as being members of the Lord's church for however long, and then even for some of us being brought up in Christian homes, to know what it's like to not have that access to God, is beyond us. And so that if we're not careful, we will lose sight on how important and how relevant this actually is. And it should create within us a greater sense of appreciation for what we have. And that's an important element because of how often we end up losing appreciation for things that we've had all our lives. So then to read these verses and read these passages and then to place ourselves there, back in that situation. And then just to think about, man, how crazy it would be to not be able to come in a setting like this to where we're not able to come close to God. That we have to lean on somebody else. We have to lean on this office, this priesthood, and then the high priest, so that he can get close to God for us. And even then, he can only get so close.
Or corrupt.
Huh?
Or corrupt.
Explain.
The priest can be corrupt.
Oh, right. Yeah, so here's this office, here are these men, they're supposed to be doing this on our behalf, but even they can be corrupted. As we are finding in the life of Christ is what they ended up doing. They had corrupted so much of what their office was. Well, now we're not having to worry about that. So, I say not worry about it. It can still happen. But it's one of those situations of, well, if this office gets corrupted, then what am I supposed to do? And there's no worry with that. You can still go before God. You're a priest. Just as with everybody else. But then also to get us in the right frame of mind with the things that Jesus is going to talk about in his prayer, or what it is that Jesus is going to pray before his crucifixion. So to bring this introduction section to a close, just quick breakdown of John 17, verses 1 through 5. Jesus is going to pray for himself. Verses 6 through 19, he's going to make prayer for the apostles. And it's important to remember that is a section for the apostles, because if you're not going to make that an application for the apostles, then it's going to lead you to a lot of problems in understanding. And then verses 20 through 24, he prays for the world, and in that specifically for the church. He's going to make mention of those that will believe the words of the apostles. So those are going to follow in the gospel and being obedient to that and having their sins forgiven. And then there's a summary and a conclusion of this prayer with the last 2 or 3 remaining verses there of chapter 17, 2 verses 25 and 26. So this chapter is going to set the stage for what is coming in the New Testament, of him being our high priest over that better covenant that's built upon better promises. And that is in fact superior to that first law that they had. So we'll pick up verse 1 next week and start going through verse by verse. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?